Asterisk. We are the supreme survivors, General Kathos intoned, his voice vibrating through the war hall like the pulse of a dying star. Our world forged us in fire, in acid storms, in eternal war. No species can rival the Zal dominion. We are alone at the top. Asterisk. 100 eyes burned with the cold certainty of his words. The gathered warlords, each a master of conquest, each bearing the scars of 1,000 battles, stood in silent affirmation. They did not question the truth because they had lived it. Vralis. 9. Their homeworld was not a place of comfort, nor was it meant to be. It was a crucible, a world that consumed the weak and tempered the strong. Born under a gravity 3 times the galactic norm, raised in an atmosphere laced with sulfuric poisons and hardened by a landscape that had never known stillness, the Zal had never encountered a species that could truly stand against them. Conquest, for all its brutality, had become routine, a mere formality enacted against civilizations that thought themselves strong but had never known true suffering. Kathos strode to the center of the chamber, his black armor glinting under the bioluminescent glow of the war hall's towering walls. At his gesture, the chamber darkened, and a holographic projection materialized in the air before them. A planet, blue and green, with curling white clouds wrapped around it like a predator's breath. Sol 3, intoned the voice of the High Archivist, an elder whose skin bore the intricate latticework of burn scars that marked the highest-ranking Zal scholars. Asterisk. Designation, Earth. Distance from homeworld, 42,000 light cycles. Population, approximately 8 billion. Primary species, human. Technological tier, variable. Defensive infrastructure, none detected. Asterisk. A low murmur rippled through the warlords. No defensive infrastructure? No planetary shields, no orbital weapons arrays, no signs of centralized military coordination? It was unheard of. Even the weakest of their conquered worlds had mounted some feudal resistance. Kathos tilted his head, and yet the data suggests their civilization persists. What? The High Archivist hesitated. Their environment is aberrant, unlike any we have previously encountered. A new sequence of projections appeared, each one more perplexing than the last. The warlords watched as Earth's history unfolded before them, not through the advancement of technology, but through a constant, violent dance with catastrophe. Massive storms that dwarfed the tempests of Vralis 9, earthquakes that split continents, plagues that consumed millions in mere decades, extinction events that should have ended all life, yet never did. Then came the wars. Not mere territorial skirmishes like those of lesser species, but wars fought over ideas, over pride, over the sheer, insatiable hunger for conflict itself. Civilizations rising and falling in cycles of destruction and rebirth, over and over, as if war was written into the marrow of the species itself. And yet, each time, the humans adapted. Each time, they grew stronger. Kathos studied the images, his jaw tightening. These creatures, how have they not succumbed to extinction? The High Archivist's voice wavered. We do not know. For the first time in years, something unfamiliar slithered through the warlords' minds. It was not fear, not yet, but an unease, an uncertainty they had not known in lifetimes. Kathos dismissed it with a wave of his hand. It is irrelevant. Their failure to die only means they will offer us more sport. We shall take their world as we have taken all others. A ripple of agreement passed through the warlords, though it was not as immediate as before. Something about Earth gnawed at the back of their minds, something about the way it refused to break. But the thought was fleeting. The Zal did not dwell on uncertainties. Hours later, Kathos stood alone in the war chamber, staring at the frozen image of Earth rotating silently before him. He had fought 1,000 campaigns across the void, torn the strongest warriors of the cosmos apart with his own hands. Yet something about this world unsettled him. Perhaps it was the sheer improbability of its existence. A species that had evolved on such an unstable world should not have reached civilization, much less interstellar significance. Yet here they were, standing on the precipice of galactic awareness, utterly unprepared, yet inexplicably unshaken. He exhaled sharply and turned away. The time for questions was over. The time for war had come. As he left the chamber, he cast one final glance at the projection of Earth. It remained still, unassuming, its storms swirling, its lands teeming with fragile life. It did not yet know what was coming. The descent was unceremonious, calculated. Zal warships slipped into Earth's atmosphere like silent blades, their black hulls devouring light, absorbing radar signals. No orbital defenses, no planetary shields, no coordinated warning systems. It was almost insulting. The Dominion had conquered civilizations that had fought back with fleets of dreadnoughts, with quantum weapons, with the wrath of entire solar empires. And yet here was Earth, naked, oblivious, unarmed. General Kathos stood on the bridge of the Voracis, arms clasped behind his back, his predatory gaze fixed on the screens before him. Earth sprawled out in chaotic patterns beneath them, great cities buzzing with activity, vast swathes of wilderness carved by violent rivers, war zones peppered with fire and ruin. Even as he watched, a cluster of explosions flared somewhere in the eastern lands, human war machines engaged in some meaningless internal struggle. It was the same across the planet. Humans fought themselves with the same viciousness they should have been reserving for outside threats. Confirming initial reconnaissance, intoned the ship's intelligence officer, his voice tinged with the clinical detachment of someone who had seen too many worlds fall. Localized conflicts in multiple sectors, civil unrest in others. No sign of planetary unity. He glanced at Kathos. It is as we suspected. They are too primitive to coordinate a defense. Kathos said nothing. His gaze lingered on the battlefield below. Smoke curled into the air, black as a dying star. And through the haze, figures moved, small, fragile. Humans. Some fought with rifles, others with scavenged weapons, their bodies covered in grime, their faces locked in expressions of sheer, unrelenting determination. His jaw tightened. These creatures should not have been capable of war, not in the way the Zal understood it. Their world was unstable, riddled with famine, disease, disasters that should have culled their numbers beyond repair. They had no genetic enhancements, no biological adaptations that made them superior warriors. Their lifespans were insultingly short. Their bodies were weak. And yet, they survived. Deploy the strike teams, he ordered. Sleek, black Zal drop ships streaked through the sky, breaking formation as they descended on multiple points of conflict across the planet. The humans below barely reacted. There were no sirens, no evacuations, no planetary broadcasts signaling an invasion. The humans merely glanced at the sky before returning to their battles, as if war had become so routine that even an extraterrestrial threat was just another complication in their never-ending cycle of destruction. Kathos and his elite warriors touched down in a ruined city, a place once known as Zydomir, according to intercepted human transmissions. The remnants of war scarred its streets. Buildings stood as skeletal husks, shattered windows gaping like empty eye sockets. The air was thick with the acrid stench of burning metal, gunpowder, and something worse, something distinctly human. The Zal fanned out with military precision, their weapons humming with restrained energy. They expected surrender, fear, the usual displays of inferiority. What they got was gunfire. A hail of bullets ricocheted off Kathos' armor, his shields flaring bright with kinetic absorption. He turned his head, mildly intrigued, as a group of humans emerged from the wreckage, their weapons primitive yet wielded with a grim efficiency. One of them, a man with blood smeared across his forehead, stood at the front, expression unreadable. Kathos took a step forward. "Do you understand what you face?" His voice was a low growl, distorted slightly by his helmet's translator. "Lay down your weapons. You cannot resist the Dominion." The man did not lower his rifle. His face was lined with exhaustion, but his eyes burned with something deeper, something Kathos had seen only in the most desperate of warriors. Not submission, not even defiance, Something worse. Understanding. The man exhaled, shifting his grip on his weapon. You think this is the first time we've faced extinction? His voice was rough, his accent thick, but there was no fear in it. Only certainty. You think you're the first ones to come here thinking we're weak. He bared his teeth in something that might have been a smile, but there was no mirth in it. You don't know what you've walked into. Kathos tilted his head. He had heard defiant speeches before, the last words of dying civilizations. Yet this felt different. Before he could respond, the humans attacked. They did not fight like prey. They fought like something cornered, something that had spent its entire existence clawing its way out of oblivion. There was no hesitation, no calculation for survival. They fought as though they had already died 1,000 times before and had simply decided to keep going. Kathos watched as one of his warriors fell, his armor cracked open by an explosive device strapped to the chest of a human soldier. Another Zal screamed as fire engulfed his body, an improvised Molotov burning hotter than it had any right to. These are not strategic maneuvers. They were acts of sheer, reckless willpower. For the first time in his long life, Kathos hesitated. They should have broken. Any other species would have. Even the most warlike civilizations the Zal had encountered would have surrendered before such a superior force. Yet these humans, they did not fear death. A woman with torn clothes and blood-matted hair lunged at one of the Zal, driving a makeshift spear through the exposed joint of his armor. She had no training, no enhancements, yet her body moved with the fluidity of someone who had fought her entire life. Because she had. Kathos stepped forward, backhanding her with enough force to break bones. She hit the ground hard, but to his astonishment, she did not stay down. She spat blood onto the ground, wiped her mouth, and glared up at him with something that sent an unfamiliar chill down his spine. Not anger, not even hatred. Pity. Strongest in the galaxy, she murmured, laughing through broken teeth. And yet you don't understand what we are. Kathos clenched his fists. This was wrong. The Zal were the ultimate survivors, the apex predators of the void. No species could outmatch their endurance, their resilience. And yet, his warriors were struggling. Not against superior technology, not against biological enhancements, but against sheer, unyielding willpower. He turned, his gaze sweeping over the battlefield, and what he saw tightened something deep in his chest. The humans did not just fight. They adapted. Their tactics shifted mid-battle, their strategies evolving on instinct alone. They did not hesitate to sacrifice, to endure pain if it meant victory. He watched a wounded man pull himself toward a fallen rifle with a shattered leg, his face twisted in agony, but his focus unbroken. He watched a child barely past adolescence lob an explosive with perfect precision, her face expressionless as Zal bodies scattered in the blast. They were supposed to be weak. They were supposed to crumble. Yet they fought as though war was written into their bones. A voice crackled in his earpiece, strained, frantic. General, we are encountering resistance across all sectors. Casualties significant. Kathos turned his gaze back to the woman at his feet, who smiled up at him through the blood staining her lips. You don't belong here, she whispered. For the first time in his life, Kathos felt something entirely unfamiliar. Doubt. The screams of dying Zal warriors echoed through the ruins. General Kathos stood motionless, his armor streaked with human blood, his mind warring with a realization he could no longer suppress. The battle should have ended by now. The humans should have broken, but they hadn't. Across the smoldering streets, his forces struggled against an enemy that refused to obey the natural order. It wasn't their weapons. Those were crude, inefficient. It wasn't their strategy. There was barely any coordination at all. It was the way they fought, the way they endured, as if pain and suffering were merely inconveniences, as if war was not a burden but a birthright. Kathos had witnessed species beg for mercy, had seen entire civilizations surrender at the first sign of inevitable defeat. But these humans, these fragile, short-lived creatures, fought as though they had nothing to fear, not even death. A transmission crackled in his earpiece, the voice of his second-in-command thick with static and urgency. "General, we cannot hold this position. They are not like the others. We are sustaining losses far beyond projection." Kathos did not answer. He turned his gaze to a nearby alley where a human soldier, barely more than a boy, crouched behind a rusted vehicle, his hands pressing against a wound that should have rendered him useless. Kathos had seen enough battlefields to recognize the signs of fatal injury, yet the boy's breath came in steady gasps. He was waiting, watching, calculating. The boy met his gaze and smiled. A slow, knowing, bloody grin. The shot came a second later. Not from the boy, but from somewhere above, a hidden marksman who had waited for Kathos to be distracted. The bullet struck his armor, sending him stumbling back a step. It didn't penetrate, but the intent behind it was clear. Humans were not fighting for survival. They were hunting. Kathos clenched his jaw, moving with cold precision as he raised his weapon and fired. The boy collapsed, lifeless, but the marksman was already gone. The streets were shifting, their battle lines fluid, humans moving in and out of cover with an instinct that no training could replicate. They were adapting faster than any enemy Kathos had ever faced. A realization sank into his gut like a stone. The Dominion had always believed suffering bred strength, that Vralis, 9, was the ultimate crucible. But it had never been chosen. The Zal had been born into it, their hardships dictated by an unforgiving world. Their strength was a result of adaptation, yes, but it was forced upon them by nature. Humans? They created their own suffering. They burned their own cities, waged wars upon themselves, built empires only to reduce them to ash again and again. By choice, they weren't merely survivors. They were something far worse. They were obsessed with destruction. Kathos's grip tightened on his weapon. This world was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. He had spent his life believing the Zal were the apex species, that no race could rival their endurance. But endurance was a passive thing. A species endured because it had no other option. Humans endured because they wanted to. A sharp movement caught his eye. The woman from before, the one who had smiled through broken teeth, emerged from the wreckage, rifle in hand, stepping over the bodies of fallen Zal warriors as if they were mere obstacles in her path. There was no hesitation in her movements, no fear, only a quiet inevitability. Kathos raised his weapon. "You should not exist," he said, though whether he spoke to her or to humanity itself, he could not say. The woman exhaled, shaking her head as she wiped blood from her brow. And yet, here we are. The first shot came from behind him. A second later, another. His warriors were falling back. The Zal, who had never known fear, never known true defeat, were retreating from creatures who had no genetic modifications, no superior strength, no technological advantage. Only an iron will and an infinite capacity for suffering. A deep, gnawing dread coiled in Kathos's chest. This war had been over before it even began. Not because the humans were stronger, not because they had superior weapons, but because they had already survived far worse than the Zal could ever inflict upon them. Kathos activated his communicator. "All units, withdraw." There was a pause. His warriors had never heard those words before, but none questioned him. In the distance, the dark silhouettes of dropships began lifting off, the Dominion abandoning Earth like an animal retreating from a predator it hadn't realized was bigger than itself. As the last of his forces disappeared into the sky, Kathos lingered, eyes locked on the woman standing before him. She lowered her rifle, tilting her head slightly. "Leaving so soon?" she asked. Kathos did not answer. He turned and boarded the final dropship, the doors sealing shut behind him. As the ship ascended, he cast one last look at the planet below. Earth, so unassuming, so chaotic, remained unchanged, as if the battle had been nothing more than a brief inconvenience. A report was already compiling in his ship's database, a warning for the Dominion. Asterisk. We do not rule the harshest world. We never did. We are the children of a brutal planet, shaped by fire and war. But Earth is something else. It is not a planet that forges the strong. It is a crucible that forges monsters. And the worst part? They wear smiles. Asterisk on the ground. The woman watched the ships vanish into the clouds. Beside her, a small child, dirt-covered barefoot, his face smudged with soot, peered up at the sky. "Are they gone?" the boy asked. The woman smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "For now,